Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and before today's episode, I want to give you a quick note. This is a joint episode of the Neoliberal Podcast with the Political Orphanage. The Political Orphanage is a podcast from Andrew Heaton, and Andrew was kind enough to invite me on his show to discuss NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And we talk about why we need permitting reform in the environmental permitting process. It's a great episode, and if you enjoy the episode, you should check out Andrew's podcast and subscribe, become a listener, all that. If you enjoy this podcast, as always, you can support us at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Or you can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism and join one of our local chapters by going to cnliberalism.org/become a member. That's cnliberalism.org/become a member. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. Fun fact, the Empire State Building was a major financial flop, as in, maybe we ought to dynamite it level financial flop. Prior to its opening, the highest building in the United States was the 927-foot Bank of Manhattan. The Empire State Building dwarfed it. It dwarfed everything. Its roof height is 1,250 feet. That's 102 floors, plus the antenna on top. Construction began in 1930. Which was a bad time to open up a building with 2.8 million square feet of choice office space. The country was reeling from the stock market crash of 1929, which heralded the Great Depression. In its first year, the Empire State Building only rented 23% of its space. 3/4 of it was vacant, and it would remain half vacant through the decade. Locals took to calling it the Empty State Building, and its owners resorted to publicity stunts and desperate hopes of filling it. In 1932, they held a seance on the 82nd floor to try to contact the ghost of Thomas Edison. Workers were instructed to leave all the lights on at night to give it the appearance of actually containing people and businesses. It was originally designed to have a Zeppelin port on the roof. It came that way with the idea that it would be its own little airport, but unfortunately, Zeppelins became far less popular after the Hindenburg incident, and even if that hadn't happened, trying to dock at the top of the Empire State Building with a blimp in high winds is a challenging proposition. I believe it only happened one time. And, of course, there's that infamous episode with King Kong. That didn't help. Nobody wants to work in a building that attracts giant apes. That and commute times are the two biggest gripes of American workers. Mostly, though, problems arose from the Great Depression. Companies weren't starting up, and people couldn't afford expensive office rent. Also, this being the 1930s, 102 floors was perilously high to the average person. A lot of the businesses which otherwise might have rented there were terrified of the idea of nesting on the 40th or 50th floor. There were still people alive at this time who predated elevators. The building ended up making most of its revenue, at least early on, by selling tickets to the observation deck. 3/4 empty, half empty. It was selling tickets to the observation deck, and that paid the bills. It was functionally a tourist destination and not a skyscraper. It didn't actually become profitable until the 1950s. Here's the thing that most amazes me about the Empire State Building, however. Not its height, not the fact that it had a Zeppelin port, not the fact that it wasn't profitable for 20 or 30 years. Picture that iconic building in your mind. You've seen it in the skyline of every rom-com ever shot in New York City. One of the tallest buildings in the world, an icon, 102 stories high, taller than the Eiffel Tower, gargantuan square footage. If you add it up, it's a little more than half that of Vatican City. The construction of that building, that massive feat of engineering, a tower which scraped the sky itself, a mountain of cement and steel, that construction took 410 days. 410 days! Just over a year to build the Empire State Building. Isn't that astonishing? Now let's flash forward to now. In 2006, a judge granted an injunction against the city of San Francisco to put in new bicycle lanes. The city had not adequately filed the necessary environmental review process to put them in. To install those bicycle lanes took the city 2.5 years, plus 1,353 pages of paperwork, and $1 million just to pay the clerks to deal with the regulatory hurdles. The Golden Gate Bridge, that iconic red bridge spanning the bay, it's a bay, right? Spanning the bay near San Francisco, that took about 4 years of construction. Also an engineering feat. Adding a suicide barrier to that same bridge starting in 2015 hasn't happened yet. It's due to be completed next year. It took 4 years to build the Golden Gate Bridge, and it will take 7 years to add a suicide barrier to it. Quite literally, it takes more time to build bicycle lanes in San Francisco than it took to erect the Empire State Building. Why is that? That's the question we're going to explore today, right here on The Political Orphanage. My guest today is Jeremiah Johnson. He is the founder of the Center for New Liberalism, the host of the Neoliberal Podcast, and a brother in arms in the crusade against harmful overzoning. Jeremiah, good to see you again.
Great to be here, Andrew. Always.
So you made my life very easy this week, Jeremiah, because you reached out to me with a topic that you were burning with the ferocity of 1,000 suns to discuss. What is it?
It's the sexiest topic in politics. It's what the midterms will be decided by.
Right.
Permitting reform. Everybody's favorite topic.
That is, I mean, whenever you see James Carville melt down and yell about the deficiencies of the Democratic Party or the evil of the Republican Party, it's usually about permitting reform.
You know, it's funny. It is a really under the radar thing, but it's been getting more attention recently. And I think it's one of the most quietly influential things that nobody in politics really pays attention to. It's not exciting. It's not talking about inflation or the economy or abortion or the war in Ukraine or whatever. But I think that it is one of those things that will be long run, very influential, you know, and it's the kind of thing that can help determine the trajectory of like your civilization, which sounds like a huge thing. But, you know, I worry a lot about long-term growth and fixing long-term problems like climate change. And this is one of the key stopping points to that.
Well, I've read some of the op-eds that you've written in various publications, and one of the things you point out is that because permitting requirements are so onerous at this time nationally, it ends up having an effect that sort of stabilizes and prolongs the status quo, which means that if you want to build solar panels, you want to put them on the White House, you want to make a wind turbine at Martha's Vineyard, all that stuff becomes much harder, and so the percentage of the energy grid that comes from things like coal sticks around longer because we're not able to revise and dynamically change the energy sources.
Yeah. I think that's a really key point, and it's something we're going to hit over and over as we talk about this, that fundamentally, when you have a lot of red tape, when you have a lot of bureaucracy, what you're doing is you're privileging the status quo. You're making the status quo really hard to change, and anything new is now prejudiced against. And like you can do this with a bunch of examples. I have so many examples I could pull off the top of my head, but there's one that I love to just give you a feel for how this kind of thing normally goes. In November 2016, Seattle voters approved an expansion of their light rail system. City of Seattle has light rail, and they just said we should build some new lines. We should expand that.
All right.
6 years later, you know, we're in November 2022 as we record this. Work has not yet begun. In January of this year, 2022, the Sound Transit, which is the entity in Seattle that is governing the light rail, released a draft of their environmental impact statement. The environmental impact statement is a statement that you have to do whenever you take any major federal action. And even though this is local, it used federal money, so it counts. And this draft environmental impact statement was 8,000 pages long. And it had taken 6 years to get to this point. And this is not even the final draft. Hundreds of millions of dollars have already been spent on this project to expand Seattle's light rail, and not a single shovel has hit the ground. Their current timeline says that the actual final environmental impact statement will probably be done sometime in 2023. And the current timeline says we're not actually going to be finished building until 2039. So, this is one example, and I could give you a bunch. Believe me, I would love for this podcast to be me for an hour giving you these examples. But like, this is what happens, right? This is, if you think it's ridiculous that we have a 23-year timeline between voting this project in and potential final approval, then you're correct. That is ridiculous, and we've got to do something to change it.
So we can talk. I'm happy to talk about permitting reform in general and permits in general, but I know that the major bugaboo you have is just that, the environmental impact review, or I guess the more specific thing, but we call it NEPA, the National Environmental.
Yeah. So this is the National Environmental Policy Act. It's considered one of America's landmark pieces of environmental legislation. It's enormously important and influential, and has been for decades. In order to comply with NEPA, NEPA says that for any major federal action that could impact the environment, you have to consider, a certain amount of things, and you have to do a NEPA review process. And this process could result in any number of things. It could result in what's called a categorical exclusion. Most actions fall under this. This is a very routine action. We don't think it's going to have an impact on the environment, so your review is very short. And it's not actually short in some cases, but short in the sense of like 100 pages of a document and a few months of review. If you have a more major project, though, you might be subject to what's called an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. And the impact statement is by far the most onerous of those. And recent analysis shows that the average environmental impact statement takes 4.5 years to complete and is 660 pages long. And this is for everything the federal government does. This is big energy projects. This is mass transit projects. This is, infrastructure. This is building ports and docks and bridges and things like that. The light rail expansion, it's dams. It's, the Forest Service being able to implement their plans to protect America's forests. It's lake restorations. It's just all kinds of stuff. Sometimes it even gets into NIMBY stuff.
And I would assume anything that includes federal grants is probably subject to this as well?
Basically anything that happens anywhere in the country, because what they say is a federal action. But federal action can be something that a federal department is doing, like the Forest Service, or it can be just a federal agency signing off on a decision or a federal money going towards something. And if you're doing $1 billion project, say $1 billion project to build solar power, I want to build some solar power in the desert. I own the land. I'm going to provide all the funding. Even then, you're probably going to have to get a permit from some agency somewhere. And that means it's going to be subject to NEPA review. Essentially, every major project of any kind that takes place anywhere in the United States can be subject to NEPA, just because of how sprawling the federal bureaucracy is.
Right. Well, you mentioned the Seattle light rail. I don't have the stats right in front of me, but I know all light rail proponents claim that it is an environmentally sound alternative to cars because it's going to have less carbon. So one would assume the environmental impact of the light rail would be it's good, and just fill out a yellow sticky note and move forward. But that is not the case. It's like a 3-year process with thousands of pages to let the government know what it already knows about light rail.
It's not even that. It's, I would love if the process was just a short analysis of, okay, we're going to pave over a field here, and that's not great. But also we're going to, save a bunch of carbon from going into the atmosphere, and we think that's awesome. Boom, here's 15 pages about it. We're done. That would be an entirely reasonable process. Mm-hmm. But that's not what actually happens. And NEPA is a very interesting law because it doesn't have actually a single element in the law that is meant to protect the environment. What NEPA does, it is a purely documentary law. It is only about documenting the harms. You could have a proposed federal action that says, I would like to nuke Oklahoma City. I would like to drop a bomb, and let's kill
sound
everybody
like Amy
there.
Klobuchar.
And and I know you used to live in Oklahoma, so that's why I chose that. But you could do that.
I'm very anti-nuking Oklahoma.
You could do that, and you would have to go through a NEPA process if you propose this. And as long as you accurately and completely documented the harms that would take place from the nuclear bomb, you would be approved.
Wait, hold on. I want to make sure I get this now. NEPA, because I just assumed National Environmental Protection Act.
Policy Act.
Policy Act, excuse me. NEPA, I was like, clearly this is designed to help the environment. I assume it's some outgrowth of the EPA. This is purely archival. This is just archival data red tape that doesn't actually have any protective element to it. So like I could take 5 years, write an environmental thing that goes, we're killing all the alligators for fun, for sport. We're going to go into the Everglades and we're going to dump in toxic waste and then kill the animals for sport. As long as I accurately do that, it can't stop me from this process. It's just this. All this red tape is just to have it on file what the damage will be.
The case law is like slightly more complicated than that, but you're 95% correct there to say, yes, it does not matter if you harm the environment. NEPA is a law that says you have to accurately document what the impact on the environment will be. And you have to consider alternatives if there's going to be an impact. But, you could literally propose, I want to pave over the Everglades. And as long as you accurately and completely document it, then it's going to be okay. You can pass your review. And that's the really insidious thing here, is that we're not even actually protecting the environment except by accident, there's this kind of view of environmentalism. If I go off on a quick tangent,
go for it.
You kind of grew up around the late 80s and 90s, right?
Yeah.
Did you ever watch the cartoon Captain Planet?
I did. And in fact, I went back and rewatched it about 5 years ago, and I would describe it as cartoonish.
So for those, if you're a younger millennial or a Zoomer and you don't know what the hell we're talking about, Captain Planet was this cartoon that was on in the 90s. And it was a great picture of 90s environmentalism, which is very different from the environmental movement today. And it was very focused on there's a bunch of pollution that's going on. There's landfills everywhere. The villain of every episode was this cartoon industrialist guy who was dumping shit in the rivers and poisoning fish and stuff just because he wanted to, because it was fun. And yes. Captain Planet was a superhero with some teenage sidekicks who would save the day.
And a monkey.
Yeah, and a monkey. There was a monkey involved for some reason. But there was this really big thing where, in Captain Planet, there's always this thing you have to stop. The key to environmentalism is stopping things, whether it's a factory or a landfill or somebody's trying to kill the whales and we've got to save the whales. That was environmentalism. And through the 70s and 80s and 90s, that was what environmentalism was about, was stopping things. Where we find ourselves today in the environmental movement is very much a different place. Climate change is the overriding concern, partially because we were successful at a lot of things. The hole in the ozone layer is fixed, or it's fixing. It's healing, and we know it's going to fix itself if we stay on the current trajectory.
Right. We banned CFAs, which has been incredibly palliative to that regard. We've basically got rid of...
And so that's very good.
Got rid of acid rain for the same reason, because we were able to come in and stop things.
Mm-hmm. Acid rain has been fixed. No, there's probably Zoomers out there who don't know that acid rain is a thing. They probably think we're talking about sci-fi stuff, because I've had conversations with 20-year-olds who don't know that acid rain was a real thing and not a movie thing. That there was a real acid rain used to be a problem. But this is my point, is that, air quality is up since the 70s and 80s. Water quality is up. We've done a bunch of really good stuff. But now the problem is that we need to build more stuff. We've had these wins, and climate change is now the environmental problem. And the way you get out of climate change is you have to build a ton of stuff. You have to be pro-changing things. And that means building more electric cars. It means building more mass transit systems. It means more nuclear and wind and solar. and more transmission in our electrical grid. We need increased transmission rates. We need to reform the electrical grid. We need better battery technology. We need geothermal. We need all this stuff. And it requires a lot of building. And it's a problem because our environmental movement, the Sierra Club and people like that, are stuck in this mindset of like their history is the history of blocking things.
Yeah. Whereas, I would say like an environmental policy, which is very complex, is at root about trade-offs. There are occasionally solutions, or I should say the trade-off is so overwhelmingly one-sided that we could just call it a solution. Banning CFAs is a decent example of that. There was a negative externality causing a hole in the ozone, so we banned it. It did affect some businesses that were producing CFAs, but that was pretty minor compared to the upswing. However, most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, it is not a silver bullet solution. It's you're going to take up all this land and it's going to affect these animals, but the solar panels are going to reduce the carbon output coming from this area, and so it's overall going to be a net benefit. And you're having to figure out where do we want to allocate these decisions in a way that's most effective. But it's all trade-offs. It's just a series of trade-offs that are being made, hopefully in the smartest way possible. And I take your very astute point that you're right. The 90s was about blocking the bad guy. The current era is about building better new stuff to transition us to something else.
And that's what NEPA essentially makes very, very difficult, because bad faith groups and groups that only want to block things for selfish reasons are able to use NEPA to initiate very long lawsuits to basically block anything. You have all these things where, there's wind projects off the coast of Massachusetts where they've been fighting for a decade in legal battles to be able to build wind power. And this is, off the coast. The only thing that's ever being ruined here is somebody's view. But there's a lot of rich people in like Cape Cod or Martha's Vineyard or whatever in Massachusetts with nice, multi-million-dollar homes and views over the ocean. And they're not happy, so they sue repeatedly. And NEPA makes it very, very easy for them to do that. Because, again, the requirement of NEPA is that you have to document all the harms, and you have to do so in a complete and thorough manner. And current judicial understanding of that requires an enormous amount of work. And this is its own story that if you would permit me. Do you like going down rabbit holes, Andrew?
I do, in fact, love going down rabbit holes. Rabbit away, Jeremiah.
So, let me see. How do I want to say this? So the word I'm going to use here is vibes. Okay. This is all just about vibes.
This is a normal policy term. This is the kind of thing you'd learn at a policy school over there at Harvard.
So if you went to Harvard Law, you'd learn the term stare decisis, which is about judicial precedent. And there are institutional norms and accepted practices and all these very fancy phrases that sound very bureaucratic and sometimes even Latin to show how fancy we are. But, all of these things, institutional norms and accepted practice and stare decisis and judicial precedent, they really just mean what are your vibes? What does it feel like we need to do? What does everybody else say that we need to do? What are the vibes in the room? Now, in the 1970s and early 80s, the vibes were such that you could actually write an environmental impact statement and it would be like 15 pages long. And that was the accepted, how do we need to account for what the impact on the environment will be. And we need to do so in a complete manner. Okay, I guess we can do that in 15, 20 pages. And that was accepted. You can go look up some of these. They exist. And then over time, that process started getting longer and longer. And what would happen is one group would sue and they would say, well, they didn't consider this thing that obviously it'll have an impact on the environment this way. And maybe they would win. And so now every other NEPA review, every other environmental impact statement, basically forever, now has to write a section considering that thing, that specific factor, and then somebody else sues the next year talking about a completely different thing, and now they win. And so now you have to write a new thing. There's a second section that every review has to include, or else they're going to get sued and potentially have to stop their project. And over time, the number of things that you're supposed to consider for it to be a complete and comprehensive, kind of thing just goes up and up and up. And you can actually track this. The average environmental impact statement is increasing by 39 pages a year. Like you can track the length of these things over time.
But the environment's not getting bigger at that rate. In fact, many would contend that it is the same size or smaller.
Yeah. So literally the only reason that we now think, It's appropriate that these reviews need to be 1,000 pages long, and we used to think they could be 15 pages long. The only reason we think that is like literally it's a vibe shift. We used to think this was complete. Now the standard accepted practice and precedent is that you need 1,000 pages. And that's where we are. And you run into all these ridiculous stories of, that California can't build their light rail system, or their high speed rail system, I should say, because of NEPA reviews. Instead of going from Los Angeles to San Francisco, it's like going from like Bakersfield to like Mercer or something really sad. And they've basically given up on trying to connect SF and LA. And then they said, we're not giving up. And then they gave up again. And then they said, we're not giving up. And it's this whole sad thing. And you can just go through all these examples of how difficult it is now to build anything. And so that's why, I wrote a piece that kind of kicked off my interest in this called The Case for Abolishing the National Environmental Policy Act. And basically my argument is the environment would benefit if we abolished NEPA. And I think it's true. So I don't know.
Well, I'm definitely going to add your take that bureaucracy benefits the status quo. Bureaucracy is something that gives weight to the status quo. So if you think the status quo is where we need to be in terms of the environment, bureaucracy is your friend. If you think that we ought to be moving in a different direction, then we ought to be eliminating red tape and making society more dynamic. However, I do want to make sure I understand a couple of things here. So it becomes incredibly difficult to build anything. It sounds to me almost like you're describing the permitting corollary to how permission slips that you write to go rock climbing have now ballooned to like 15 different pages, except in this instance, every single institution's having to write it from scratch every time. It's not boilerplate, but it's expanding because they want to be able to hit any possible impact at all. If they don't hit an impact, does it make them more subject to lawsuits? And are those lawsuits being gamed by NIMBY factors?
That's essentially it. You've hit the nail on the head there. The fear here is always lawsuits. Federal agencies want to be able to do things efficiently. They're given money to do a certain kind of thing to fulfill their mission. I'll use the Forest Service as an example. They want to protect forests. They want to come up with good plans to protect forests from these massive wildfires that are going on. They want to do fun things like expand trails and like protect the animals that live there. And, there's all these things the Forest Service does, and they want to be able to do them efficiently and quickly, and they're not able to. And it's because of the fear of lawsuits that these things have to be so long. And there are groups that basically go around and consult, if you don't like what's going on, here's how you use NEPA. We will train you to use NEPA to sue this project and say that they have not adequately considered whatever in their environmental assessment or in their environmental impact statement. And, we will be able to tie this up for years and maybe defeat them. Maybe they'll win in the end, but we'll have stopped them for 4 or 5 years. And a lot of this is the same kind of concerns you see when it comes to NIMBYism. This is local homeowners who don't want a solar project 2 miles down the road because they think it'll negatively impact their home's value for some reason. Or there's all kinds of reasons people do this. You even actually see environmental groups doing it. There are groups like the Sierra Club.
I would imagine two things that are even tangentially environmental, like I am planning to build a homeless shelter on the outskirts of my town. Somebody might swoop in and be like, it's pretty close to that creek. You shouldn't build that homeless shelter because we really just want homeless people to evaporate. We're afraid they'll hurt housing costs, but blah, 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 the environment.
Yeah, so there's groups like the Sierra Club or like Sunrise that are kind of like left NIMBY environmentalists. And there are a lot of, environmentalists who are YIMBYs who believe in the power of like building dense cities and mass transit. But there are other groups that basically just try to block things. And it's exactly as you described. They're using the tools that are available to them to block things they don't like for kind of bad faith reasons. And it's just it's insanely frustrating to see this, especially from groups that claim to be like environmental justice focused. And it drives me up the wall.
Well, but, the NEPA has the word environment in it, which means we should blindly promote it at all costs because it's a thing that we like. We don't need to know anything more than it's environmental. Is it because it's NEPA, I realize it's not the same words as the EPA. Is this do you file it with the EPA? What's the relationship between the two?
So the best way to describe NEPA in relation to other climate law is it's often described as like an umbrella act, that your obligations under like the Clean Air Act, if you have them, can be taken care of within the NEPA process. Under the Clean Water Act, if you might be impacting water somehow, if you have obligations under the Clean Water Act, it can be taken care of under the NEPA process. And so NEPA can act as this kind of umbrella of like everything can fall under NEPA to some extent. Mm-hmm. And that's just because of how sprawling NEPA has gotten, that NEPA says you have to consider all environmental impacts. So a lot of other laws get swept under that. That's kind of how I would describe it without getting into the real nitty gritty of what happens there.
Okay. And you're not calling for the abolishing of the EPA. You want to get rid of the NEPA, correct?
Correct. The National Environmental Policy Act, I think it does more harm than good at this case, at this point. And one of the things I did when I was researching this problem was try to find like a bunch of success stories. What is NEPA? What are the harms that NEPA has really stopped from happening? And look, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of NEPA reviews. And so there are going to be instances where they had some wins that it's hard not to when you've had that many. Yeah. But the wins are really not very impressive when you stack them up against the delays that they cause and the harms that they cause, just straight up from environmental stuff. I could provide you a list of dozens of different straight environmental projects that have been delayed or killed by NEPA. And this is not, fossil fuel stuff. This is not even neutral stuff like we want to build a bridge or a port or whatever. This is straight up environmental projects that have been killed. And I think it's doing more harm than good. And when I think about like what should we want environmental legislation to do, I think that we have to focus on outcomes versus process. Because one of the problems with NEPA is that it's so process focused.
Right.
It, like I said, it literally doesn't require you to do things that are good for the environment. It only requires you to document things.
And document it extensively in every potentiality.
Yes, to be, complete. That's why it's spiraled out of control and why the length of these documents and the length of these reviews is so long. But when I think about the environmental wins that have defined the last several decades, we mentioned a few of them. Acid rain was conquered, and people don't even know what it is anymore because we banned specific things. We set a specific standard. We set an outcome. You cannot use this specific chemical anymore. You cannot do this specific type of thing. And then acid rain was conquered. And it wasn't about, we had a bunch of community hearings, to talk about our feelings about acid rain. And we wrote 1,000-page documents about it. It was that we just banned the thing that was causing acid rain. And then, you can tell a similar story for the hole in the ozone layer, which is now being closed, which is now being fixed. It's on a great trajectory. We're all very happy. We banned chlorofluoro hydrocarbons or whatever they're called.
CFCs.
Yeah, CFCs. It's chlorofluoro something. And I'm not a scientist, so I can't pronounce it correctly.
Me neither. That's why I just memorized the acronym. I have no idea.
we banned CFCs. We didn't ask like there's all these. I'm on the center left. And the people who drive me crazy the most are sometimes in this argument the people on the left who I want to be on my side, and they're not sometimes because they're so focused on like, well, we've got to, talk to our constituencies. We've got to have community input. We have to make sure this is not harming communities of color. And we've got to talk to environmental justice activists and labor groups. And I'm like, none of that fixes the problem. You're so focused on process. You're so focused on process and bureaucracy and what's happening here that you're not actually doing the thing. You're not actually banning CFCs if you're spending all your time in committee meetings and writing reports. All I want is for us to have standards. When there's a problem, let's have a set standard. Again, Clean Air Act sets, very scientifically based numerical standards. Clean Water Act does the same thing and they worked. And so I just want to get rid of the process and start doing things that help the environment.
I agree with all of that. I will add to it that I see a kind of ill-fitting religiosity that ends up pervading environmental discussions. I'm an environmentalist, and by environmentalist, I mean somebody who cares about the environment and actively does things to protect it. And when I say actively does things to protect it, I don't mean I vote for candidates that I think are environmentalists every 2 years. I donate money to various things, various institutions that protect the environment. Sometimes when I travel, I go volunteer places. So it's something that I actively do and I actively sacrifice resources for. I find that for a lot of people, they're not really environmentalists, they're ecoists. I'm an environmentalist because I'm looking to protect the environment, and I'm going through these trade-offs and saying, okay, clearly nuclear power is brilliant, because if we add up every single death from nuclear power and nuclear explosions combined, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Fukushima, Chernobyl, add all those up, the deaths caused by nuclear power is still lower than that caused by coal on a per wattage basis. In fact, it's lower than any other form of energy. So from my perspective as an engineering mind that is looking at trade-offs, nuclear power is great. Ecoists it's a religious presumption for them, a spiritual presumption of Mother Earth is holy, things that are of the earth are good, there are sinful forms of energy, and there are holy forms of energy. The holy forms of energy are wind and hydroelectric and solar, and the sinful forms of energy are coal and, for whatever reason, nuclear. And then we start talking, and I'm like, oh, you're having this whole spiritual journey you're going on through what is, to me, a series of policy considerations that we need to make. And we're going to have a very difficult time adjudicating this because you're just trying to swat down the enemy religion and promote your own. And I'm not trying to do either of those things. I'm trying to actually help the environment.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of failure modes that the left falls into here. And I will fully admit to doing a little bit of hippie punching here, and the left hates when I do this. And I should also admit that, part of the reason I get so frustrated is I want them to be on my team. I am naturally on the center left. And I think the people who are further left than me should be, they should accept what I'm saying. This is a great idea. Well, it will help you accomplish the thing you want to accomplish. So why are you not on board with this? But I think there are failure modes to left politics, like there are to any kind of politics. And specifically, the left is often really, really concerned with getting input from these constituencies. We have to talk to communities of color. We have to talk to low income communities. We have to talk to labor groups and environmental justice groups. And process and community organizing are such a central part of the identity of being part of the left that when I say you need to stop having so much process, whether this is housing, you need to stop having so many community input meetings and just build housing. You need to stop having so much process for NEPA and stop holding public hearings and just build the clean energy. Just do it and stop talking about it. It's not something that they can ever think that, more rounds of community input is bad here. It's almost a totemic religious thing that more rounds of community input can only be good. And again, this is not everybody on the left. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I do think that's a failure mode of left politics. And I think you described another one, which is they'd rather hurt oil and gas companies than help the environment. Yes, I think that there's some, like Joe Manchin, as part of the permitting reform side deal, to get into very concrete politics. Joe Manchin wanted to have a side deal on top of the Inflation Reduction Act. It wasn't in the act, but it was understood there was going to be a side deal. He wanted permitting reform. We're going to bring it up in some other bill. So they called it the side deal. And one of the things he wants is to do this stuff that I'm talking about, reduce the length of these environmental impact statements, both in the number of pages they take and how long it takes. And he wants more of them to have categorical exclusions, which is a shorter version of the NEPA review. It's much easier to get through. And as part of that, he also said, I want this one pipeline approved. It's a natural gas pipeline. I just want it approved. And so a lot of groups have decided to oppose his permitting reform side deal because it has a natural gas pipeline included in it. And this is it's like a religious point of view. You can't ever give anything to the oil and gas companies, even if on net this whole thing is going to be really, really good. You can't give them a win. And that frustrates the hell out of me.
Well, and with natural gas, too. I mean, natural gas, we're burning it, therefore it's evil. But natural gas like that was able to propel us over the Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah.
Back to go back to the 90s when you and I were watching Captain Planet, America didn't sign the Kyoto Protocols. And that was a huge deal. And we were the only country, I think, or at least we got there first. We not only hit them anyway and exceeded them, and that was because we'd shifted over to natural gas, which produces less carbon than coal. So it is, again, it's about these trade-offs. Natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel than coal is.
Yeah.
And so if
well,
you're
and
specifically
specifically,
facilitate the one and decline the other, good.
To specifically get into what's going on with this individual pipeline, it's going to be providing natural gas mostly to Virginia, and it's probably going to be displacing coal. So yeah, the embarrassing thing, the really like humiliating thing about people who are so against this pipeline is that the pipeline might be net carbon good. It might be removing carbon from the atmosphere on net. It's not clear because it will, like, having a pipeline will actually promote more natural gas being burned, and so it'll displace some coal. But it's unclear. It could actually, it's very fuzzy. This could be good for the environment, the pipeline by itself. Beyond that, I'm just thinking, like, look, Joe Manchin voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, which, you know, it is mostly not about inflation. It's mostly a $500 billion investment in clean energy of all kinds. It is the largest investment in clean energy and environmentalism that the federal government of the United States or any government anywhere has ever done. That's really what the IRA is. It's mostly a clean energy bill called the Inflation Reduction Act because that's good politics. And I'm looking at this and saying, the king of coal, Joe Manchin, just voted for your biggest ever environmental funding package. Give him what he wants. Give him whatever he wants. And like, this is how politics happens. Like, shut your mouth, give the coal man what he wants because he gave you $500 billion of climate funding. Like, it's not any simpler than that, you know, because if you don't do the permitting reform deal, again, you're just locking into place oil and coal and fossil fuels. And I don't know. And look, even if you are making it easier to both build clean energy and making it easier to build fossil fuel dirty energy, the cost curves at this point are such that everybody knows the future is solar and wind. The cost curves for solar and wind are going down so rapidly. Nobody's like, we know where the future is. Investment is pouring into this stuff. I'm beside myself at this. So, well, I've turned into a ranting maniac now.
No. This is good. This is my kind of rant. You've convinced me. I am now officially against NEPA. I think it's a bad idea. And on top of that, this strikes me as one of those situations that's actually low-hanging fruit guarded by dragons. If you are a pro-business Republican that wants to erect mighty skyscrapers and make money, NEPA is standing in your way. If you're a Democrat that gets hard for infrastructure spending and dreams of solar panels and green energy, NEPA is standing in your way. It seems to me that the only people that really benefit from NEPA are attorneys that plan to sue people. So if you're an American who loves lawsuits and you think lawyers are terrific and you like that we have lots of lawsuits, NEPA is your friend. They should call me. I would name NEPA like the Lawyer Subsidy Act of 1963 or something like that. Like, rename it the Lawsuit Subsidy Act. And they'd be like, I think we should be getting rid of the Lawsuit Subsidy Act.
It's so funny that you say that because the only people who I've talked to who defend NEPA, like in its entirety, and defend this process, there's two types. It is environmental justice activists on like that fringe left kind of who are just religiously married to, you know, community input. And I should say, this is not like even most people on the left. There's a lot of good people on the left who buy who buy my argument. And then the second group is basically consultants and lawyers. These are the people who actually produce the reports themselves. They initiate the lawsuits, or they are the consultants who write the reports, because when you're writing a 1,000-page NEPA report, you're a federal agency, you contract this out. You know, there are specialized firms who do these things now, who help you. And those people are the only ones I've ever, you know, found saying, no, actually, the system works. Everybody agrees there needs to be some type of reform. We might not necessarily agree. Like, I'd like to just get rid of it. I think you can get rid of it entirely and replace it with something else. And some people are more like, well, you just need smart reforms. We need to slim it down a little bit. But everybody thinks that there should be something done, except for the consultants and lawyers and activists who benefit materially from the system as it currently exists. And I sound like a Marxist at this point, being like the material actors, you know, blah, blah, blah. But Like it's true. Like at some point there is just material self-interest here to perpetuate the system.
Well, that sounds right. And I'm glad you brought up the fees that are paid to attorneys and to consultants on this one, because I don't think we've really talked about the cost element of it. We've talked about the time delay element of permitting that stretches these processes out, where it would take usually a year plus whatever means by which to purchase the land in order to build light rail. But now it's taking that plus 3 to 10 years to get the permitting done. If you're a construction company, you or the forest rangers or whoever it is, you probably don't have a dedicated member of your staff who knows tons of things about NEPA, which means that you have to use some of the outlay of your funding allocation to hire someone to do so, which means we are adding unnecessary costs to building infrastructure, building new buildings, building housing, and switching over to green energy. All those things become more expensive for us to do and therefore less likely for us to do them.
That's correct. I would say, though, that's the least important part of the cost increase. So, it is mechanically true that when you spend money on consultants, you've increased the cost of your project, right? If you have to write a 1,000-page report, that's going to take man hours, whether it's, people who work in your agency or consultants. That's true. That's a few $1 million or $10 million or $20 million or whatever. But that's not really the important part, I would argue, in terms of cost. The time is the important part in terms of cost. Say that you are a private company and you're trying to build a $3 billion solar project, right? And so what you have to do is you have to go get funding for that. You have to go to banks, you have to go to investors, unless you're a company that just has $3 billion in cash sitting in the bank. This is you have people financing you. And typically it's not even one source. Typically you're not going to one bank and asking for $3 billion. You're going to many different funders. And there might be complicated funding mechanisms going on, and there might be loans and equity stakes and all kinds of complicated stuff. Now, if you can go to them and say, look, we're going to build this. This is my exact plan. This is exactly how many solar panels we're going to have. This is how many blah, blah, blah gigawatts. Again, I'm not a scientist, but like how many units of power we're going to be producing. This is the current prevailing market rate. This is where we're going to build it. This is the exact layout. This is the exact date we're going to start, date we're going to finish. This is exactly how much money it's going to take. That's a great plan. They're going to love you. Now imagine going to them and saying, we'd like to do this. We want to build it on this land. It will probably take somewhere between 2 and 8 years to get NEPA approval, and we don't know which one of those numbers is more accurate right now. We don't know how much it's going to cost because we don't know how much we're going to be able to build. This is the plan we're going to submit in our environmental impact review, but they might try to force us to change it in order to get approval, or it might be discovered that, the leftward half of our solar field is sitting on, some 3-legged toad that's endangered, swamp. And so we'll have to pick it up and move over. So we don't really know what the final configuration of the plant will be. We don't know exactly where it will be. We think it'll be here. And everything becomes ambiguous. You don't know exactly when you're going to be able to start, when you're going to be able to finish, exactly what layout you're going to use. Everything that you're doing, how much you can build is up in the air. And think about taking that presentation to a bunch of financiers. The real cost is that your financing becomes much more difficult and much harder, and that that is way more important than $10 million in consulting fees for these multi-billion-dollar projects. Financing is everything, and making financing twice as hard to get because of how ambiguous everything is. Because nobody wants to invest in something where it's like between 2 and 8 years from now, we will build between 100 to 500 units of this kind of power, maybe in this general location. We'll get back to you soon.
Now, we're gonna dump our money in Berkshire Hathaway and a bunch of NFTs. Thanks.
And there's the hidden cost of all the stuff that we don't do. Just stuff that never gets started because people know how arduous the process is, and they know how long it's going to take, and they know it's going to be difficult to get financing, and so they just don't do it. There's a whole generation of infrastructure and energy projects that have just not been undertaken. That should exist but don't.
So you've converted me / educated me, as I'd had no idea what it was, on NEPA. I'm on your side. I'll get the bumper sticker. Abolish NEPA. I'm on. Is that the principal permitting hurdle that's affecting projects right now? Is it accompanied by other things at a state level? Are there municipal hiccups that are also doing this? I assume that's the biggest one because that's the one you focused on.
Mm-hmm.
But are there other ones that are in corollary to this that we would do well to get rid of?
Yes. So a lot of states and cities, I won't say a lot, but many states and cities have their own state level versions of this. Probably the most impactful is California's, which is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which essentially acts as a Californian version of NEPA and is in some ways even more strict. CEQA is like even a level above NEPA and makes it even harder. You know, there was a story recently, and this is not entirely related to CEQA, but I think CEQA plays a part in this, where I'm going to get the details here wrong, but it's something like they gave California like $8 million or something to build like something like 3 little buildings and, or like 9 public restrooms or something. And California had to give the money back because they couldn't get it done in time. The deadline is 3 years from now. And they were like, we're not going to be able to get it done because in 3 years, we're not going to be able to get through the process of community input and environmental quality review.
The procedural hurdles and paperwork is too onerous for us to build 6 bathrooms. Yeah.
And 6 bathrooms in 3 years. And like that exact number might be wrong, but that it's something like that.
It's emblematic of the problem. Yeah.
So the end story here is that there are state level versions of this. California has one. I believe Minnesota has one called MIRA. I think New York City has its own specific version of this. And so those are also important, and we need to reform those too. NEPA is the big one that covers everything, but these state level things are important as well.
I think the system that I would prefer is something like this. For big things that we need to ban, like CFCs, like chemicals that cause acid rain, have that done preemptively through legislation. And then for individual projects, I think I would have the EPA basically handle things post hoc of looking and saying, this is causing a problem. There's a negative externality resulting from this. So we are either shutting you down or we're going to charge you to pay you for the externality, and it'll go to the local community that's affected by it, or something to that effect. But I do very much share with you the skepticism that this proceduralist archival mechanism is really doing anything to stop negative externalities from occurring.
Yeah, that's the thing is, it's not like this has stopped climate change. It's not like, oh, well, NEPA stops us from doing all this stuff that we want to do, but at least it doesn't let us burn coal. At least it stopped all the coal and the oil and gas. No, obviously, we're still burning coal in this country. We're still driving around in our gas-guzzling cars. NEPA has done nothing to fix any of that. So that's why I find it frustrating. And I agree with you that, look, one of the things that annoys me the most in politics is that nobody will admit that there's a downside to their preferred policy. If you wanted a bunch of stimulus in, the height of the 2020 recession, the COVID economic crash, stimulus seemed like a great idea. But now that we're having inflation, nobody wants to admit that doing bunches and bunches of stimulus might contribute to inflation. I think it's intellectually honest to say that, oh, well, we did a bunch of stimulus. It was a good idea, but we overshot because how can you know the exact number? And now we've got some inflation. And it was a risk that we knew, and it was still worth doing. That's an intellectually honest take. And so when I apply that kind of lens here, I say, yeah, okay, look, if we get rid of NEPA, some companies are going to do some things and build some projects that are going to cause environmental harm, and we can go after them after the fact, but the harm will still have occurred. That will happen. I'm willing to accept, yes, there will be some environmental harms that are caused because NEPA didn't stop something, but on net, NEPA will, getting rid of it will allow us to do so many good things, to build clean energy so fast, to build more mass transit, to build more battery factories and transmission. Housing. One of the things, people produce all these estimates of the Inflation Reduction Act has all this investment in climate, and it's blah blah blah. There's X number of tons of carbon that will be out of the air in the end because of the Inflation Reduction Act, but a lot of that is dependent on the kind of assumptions you make. One of the assumptions is about being able to transmit energy. We need to update our transmission system of energy in this country. And if we can't do that, something like 80% of the benefits of the IRA go away. They disappear because we need clean energy in this country, and we need to transmit it everywhere. And we desperately need to update our energy transmission system. And if we can't do that because it's big projects that are required and they have to pass NEPA review, if we can't do that, then what was the point of the IRA? All the benefits vanish in smoke.
Do you have an idea of any other red tape that's holding back construction in cities? So at the top of this episode, I begin by talking about the Empire State Building, which took 410 days of construction from beginning to end. Something like that is inconceivable today.
I have a great example, by the way, not to cut you off, but the Golden Gate Bridge was finished in around 4 years.
Yeah, I mentioned that too. And the suicide barrier,
and the suicide barrier has taken longer to finish just because of the process.
Right. So is NEPA the predominant drive for all of these projects, or would be an encumbrance for them, or are there other permitting elements that are stopping it too? I could foresee a rationale for something like the Empire State Building of having lots of onerous safety permitting involved, of somebody coming in and going, it has to be X and that sort of thing. It would not surprise me if that has started as a reasonable position and expanded over the course of time as well.
I think the two biggest ones are environmental review, and that takes both NEPA and CEQA and all the local versions, and just zoning and planning in cities. And this is zoning in the literal sense of like, this is a multifamily district, this is a single family district. Single family districts are so prevalent that you can't build multifamily housing in many places. And I'm also talking about zoning in the more abstract sense of like parking requirements and setback requirements and height requirements and floor area ratios and things like that. And the general process around building housing and building things in cities, where, again, it requires, you to write a plan and submit it to the community and undergo rounds of hearings where people will yell at you about, the chemtrails and whatever's on their mind. Because if you've ever been to these community hearings, it's all old, rich, bored people who don't want anything to change ever. And that, I think, is the second big one behind environmental review, is just zoning and the process of building things in cities as it relates to community input. Those two things are the ones that I think are the biggest hurdles. And there's probably a few other small ones, but I think those are the gigantic two.
So it's NEPA and my old arch nemesis, zoning. All right, this makes sense to me. I'm for getting rid of both of these things, or at least dramatically restructuring them. Basically,
it's funny when you say dramatically restructuring there. Look, we all know in our current political age that abolish does not actually mean abolish. When we say abolish the police, what we really mean is we say, I'm kind of making fun of activists here, but
reallocate funding towards social services and have them focus on the actual violent part.
Change what the police are doing and alter their budget a little bit, but there will still be police. So when I say abolish NEPA, I would take some form of NEPA that was so fundamentally changed that it's like an abolishment of it. I get that.
Yeah.
But
meanwhile on zoning, like my ideal zoning policy is something like this. You can't have a munitions factory within X feet of a town, and you can't have smokestacks upwind of a school. Otherwise, do whatever you want. I'm pretty laissez-faire when it comes to zoning, because I think that what we're currently living in is so stultified, so overly burdensome, such an incredible quagmire designed to game the system for entrenched interests that the getting rid of it, I'm sure it would have all sorts of problems with it. I think it would still be better.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right for two reasons. Because number one, we've been doing that for as long as cities have existed. You go back to the medieval ages, and like they would make the tanners go live on the outskirts of the city because tanning leather is a gross, horrible process that smells. Nobody wants to live near them. And it's not like these cities had zoning codes. They just made the tanners live out there. And they didn't have community input hearings. They didn't have a bureaucracy. It was just a very simple decision. You can still do things like that.
Yeah, and they do in lots of European countries. Like I was in Germany over the summer. Germany's equivalent of Euclidean zoning ordinances is basically most things are mixed use, and then there's high density residential and low density residential. But even then, it's still mixed use, and that's pretty much it. Like whereas like in America, we've got like 18 to 50 different zones at any given time because we have such a hard on for SimCity and trying to micromanage everything. And then it ends up getting swept up in NIMBYism. And I, the local homeowner, want to have minimum lot sizes because that increases the value of my home and therefore my net assets. Also, weirdly enough, designing an entire system to increase the value of homes also has the side effect of making homes more expensive, which never seems to occur to anybody, that driving up the cost of housing also drives up housing costs. Fancy that.
The last thing I'll say on zoning, because I know you and I could talk for an hour straight about zoning, is that...
And we've done a prior episode on the show on zoning.
When I talked to M. Nolan Gray, who's a guy who wrote a book about zoning, one of the points he loves to make is that in Japan, their national system of zoning, it's done at a national level, and there's 18 levels of zoning for the whole country, and they are unified across the country. In something like one city, like in New York, you might have 3,000 to 4,000 different zoning designations, because there's so many little special individual districts that are carved out for this one building. And those 3,000 to 4,000 zoning designations are completely different from the 6,000 designations they might have in Philadelphia. It's in a completely different system. And so 18 versus 3,000, you really get at the level of complexity there, but not to send us down a rabbit hole of zoning.
Yes, I'll say my last thing, and then we can wrap up. Per your input on the way Japan runs it, zoning is a rare example of my otherwise localist instincts being inverted. Normally, I'm very much in favor of this pyramid of localities should deal with their own issues unless they simply can't. Then it goes up to the state level, and if the states can't adjudicate it internally, then it becomes a federal issue. Like with pollution crossing state lines, a la the EPA, makes sense to me that there's a federal organization for that. When it comes to zoning, I am increasingly of the opinion that should be handled at the state level and really should not be handled municipally, because it ends up just being a vetocracy of every single neighborhood being able to stop whatever they want. Whereas if you do it at the state level and you basically go, look, property rights are sacred. If you own it, you can do whatever you want unless it has these designated externalities or it's within a certain zone of this thing, you're allowed to do it, because that seems to be the only way to safeguard it from that vetocracy.
Well, and most of the wins, just in a factual, concrete way, have come at the state level. California has introduced a bunch of state-level bills that essentially yank power away from municipalities, and they're winning that way. You've seen things like, in Oregon, I think they banned single-family zoning as a concept statewide. And so that's just factually where the wins are coming from. So in a very concrete political sense, I agree with you. And, as a final comment here on NEPA and on environmentalism, I would just always encourage people to look at, are you supporting a process or are you supporting an outcome? Because process is only valuable when it leads to the outcomes we want. And sometimes it does. Sometimes there is a good reason to support a process. Process is not universally bad, but you can't fall in love with process. You've got to fall in love with outcome and be laser focused on, are we actually doing the thing? Are we getting to the thing that we need as a society? And that's where I think a lot of the disconnect comes NEPA wise. And I hope that there is some sort of alliance where, people on the right can look at NEPA and say, we want to deregulate this. Deregulation is awesome. Get the power out of the federal bureaucrats' hands. And people on the left can look at this and say, if we get rid of NEPA, we're going to unleash clean energy. We're going to unleash all these things we want. We're the left. We want big government. But in order to sell people big government, we've got to show them that it can be effective. So you should want this reform. I hope that we can find some marriage and actually make this happen.
As do I, and I am delighted to have spoken to you, Jeremiah. It's always a pleasure. I'm rarely thrilled to have one more thing to get angry about in life, but in this instance, I'm glad that I spoke to you about it and joined you in your ire.
My goal is always to make your blood boil, Andrew. So
that's right. You're good for my heart rate. Thanks, Jeremiah.
Always a pleasure, Andrew. Of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center.
That's the show. Thanks for listening.
I'm your host, Jeremiah.
Thank you, Jeremiah Johnson, for coming on to discuss
today's episode.
NEPA.
I want to give you a quick note.
Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program.
Episode
and thank you, patrons of the show, who make it possible.
With the Political
Until
Orphanage.
next time, I've been Andrew Heaton.
Political Orphanage
and so
is
have you.
A podcast from Andrew Heaton. And Andrew was kind enough to invite me on his show to discuss NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And we talk about why we need permitting reform in the environmental permitting process. It's a great episode, and if you enjoy the episode, you should check out Andrew's podcast and subscribe, become a listener, all that. If you enjoy this podcast, as always, you can support us at patreon.com/Neoliberal Project. Or you can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism and join one of our local chapters by going to cnliberalism.org/become a member. That's cnliberalism.org/become a member. Hope you enjoy the episode.